I just was curious about your own impression. I mean, your parents were refugees.
Yeah.
And then you cover basically refugees throughout all these years. And what did you, I mean, did you have a personal impression?
Of course I did. It depends on the situation, of course. Refugees in the tobacco factory in Shkodra were living in squalid conditions, but were in a relatively good mood. But they had an uncertain future. The refugees I met on the slopes of Lake Ohrid, on the Albanian side, were from Prishtinë, were proud, dignified, irritated that the Serbs had basically come to their homes, rung the doorbell and said, give us the car keys and get out of here in 10 minutes. And it was the car that bothered some of them more than anything else. And they, they had a second pair, but it wasn't it. And they had already turned down a military camp. They'd been sent originally, I think, to Malic, and they said, no, if you think we're sleeping on concrete, we're from Prishtinë. Don't even think about it. You give us something decent. So in the end, they ended up, rather than in an Albanian military camp, in a Greek military or Greek Red Cross encampment in the middle of a field. Beautiful view, clean air, but they were in tents. And then there were those from Jakova that I met on the beach in Durrës in a camp, an Italian camp, from Misericordia, whatever it's called. And they were being served, I was there during dinner time, and they were lining up to get pasta and penne and salad. And they were complaining. I said, what's the matter? I was starving. And they were complaining. I said, what's the matter? It's not this food. I said, what's the matter with it? It's not real food. I remember, these are Highland people, they're not from the coast. And this boy spoke up and he said, we want spoon food. And then he said, the kid said, goulash. For them, this was rabbit food, salad, pasta. This wasn't their daily staple, and the Italians were doing the best they could, and I would have eaten it all. But anyway, so that was a bit of an insight. And one can have sympathy, or one can say, come on, given the reality of what's going on, you should be ashamed of yourself. But I didn't say that. What really got me, more than anything, all of these were interesting experiences, but what grabbed me by far, and what haunts me to this day, was having been at Vrnica crossing Morina, on the Albanian side, but meters from the border, and seeing these masses of people come across. Now, that morning, and this must have been around the 2nd of May or so, 1st of May, 30th of April, somewhere in that area, 99. I had gone out first thing in the morning, and the place was empty. There was one Albanian officer leaning on the border rail, sort of looking into Kosovo. And there was no traffic in either direction, of course. And I was there with a driver and interpreter. And I said, so, where is everyone? I said, well, you see that smoke up there? I said, yeah. He said, that was a Serbian military emplacement until 2 hours ago, but a couple of American fighters took it out. I said, so your people are now, I assume, out of sight? He said, yeah, they're all downstairs in the bunker. And I said, we shouldn't be here either under those circumstances. No, you really shouldn't be here, because there could be retaliatory fire at any point. And so we went back to Kuq's, and after he told us that, look, the the Serbs don't let anyone out until after 10 in the morning. Come back around 11 or so. You'll see the scenes. And sure enough, it was right out of the BBC, Sky, or CNN. A line of cars back towards Prizren, snaking up to the border. And the people in the cars, and the cars were packed with people, and the maximum number of people you could squeeze in plus belongings. And these people were completely traumatized. It was obvious at first sight. There was an older woman from the Swiss Red Cross in uniform who reached into each car and stroked the arms of each person in the car and assured them in Albanian that they were safe, that they were no longer in Serbia and Yugoslavia, they were in Albania, they were safe. There were some people who came over on foot who had no car, who had been allowed to take a bus as far as Prizren or maybe a little further, and then they'd come over on foot. Mostly women. They were also traumatized. They had seen piles of bodies, dead people on the side of the road, where the Serb police had taken people, or soldiers or paramilitary had taken people out of cars, off buses, young men, and simply shot them. These people then came across and somehow expected that their relatives who had already left would be waiting there for them. They were disoriented. I remember them some women just putting their bags down in the middle of a field and looking around and really not knowing where to go, what was next. There was no reception center, anything up there. Others came across on tractors. Told me that he had thought he could sit it out with the family at home in Jakova, but that morning, 3 in the morning, Serb forces showed up in the house next door, took the neighbor out into the garden and shot him, and then he said, that's it, I couldn't take it any longer, and packed bags. Packed their bags, got in the car and left within minutes.
Why, this is more, remains in your memory more than you said you talked
Okay.
a lot of refugees.
No, because these people were still in a state of complete trauma. By the time you interview someone weeks after they've left, they've calmed down, they've put things into perspective, they're more relaxed. When you speak to someone who just hours earlier saw someone being killed on the basis of their ethnicity, age, or gender, and they just recount this to you as the first person they're telling this story to, obviously that grabs you very differently. So yeah, it was haunting, let's say. It's not something I'll ever forget. It was an insight into the trauma that they were going through. And when I have told this story to Kosovars, it touches a nerve with them as well. That I understand. That I know, I have an insight into what many of them did experience, what they went through.
When did you go to Kosovo after the war?
End of the summer, August. And things were relatively settled. A lot of businesses that had been burnt out during the conflict were already open for business. Others were on the verge of reopening, painting, new glass, new windows, etc. You couldn't go up to Gurmia, that was off limits. British tank and other British personnel were parked near where American University is, and you couldn't drive any further. The road between Pea and Prizren was in terrible shape, clearly rotted by a combination of airstrikes and heavy tank traffic, in really, really bad shape. Serbs from Orahovac were blockading the road from Malyshev to Jakova, which I guess was we thought the shortest way to get there in those days. Malyshev was completely devastated. Viti, was completely burnt out. Klina was completely burnt out.
And where did you stay?
I stayed where everyone else stayed, at the Hotel Grand, where I had stayed in the late 1980s, and which had just rehired all of its former staff from the 80s who'd been let go in 89, 90. So there were familiar faces there. I did not stay at the Hotel Dukajin, previously the Hotel Metochia, because at that point it was the headquarters of the Italian KFOR contingent. But I did go there for a visit, spoke to a number of officers. I interviewed, the most interesting interviews then were in Pea. I interviewed a family. The father had been, or was the director of a school for the blind. And when the NATO bombing began, if I'm not mistaken, it was either during Ramadan or Ram Bayram or something. I don't remember the exact story, but basically a lot of families weren't able to come and fetch their kids. They had gone away, and he was stuck with a lot of kids, with several dozen children that he had to feed for the duration of the bombing, which meant going out every day and essentially foraging in Pea to get food for the kids. And then in the evening, this Serb police, paramilitary, would park their vehicles on the grounds of the school, knowing that it was a safe haven, assuming that it was a safe haven, that it wouldn't be bombed. I see, he gave me an incredible interview. He was a fascinating person. I don't know if he's still alive, but worth tracking down. His daughter and her husband and child, I think, had walked in a forced march to Montenegro and had spent the conflict in the duration of the bombing in Ulcin. And she told me, we sat in their flat, modern high-rise building on the outskirts of Pea, and she said, for me this is a miracle that we can sit here today in August '99. When I left here, I had no idea whether I would ever see Kosovo again, whether we'd ever in my lifetime be able to come back. And she was younger than me by a good bit.
That was a difficult summer, and already Serbs were being either expelled or most of the time they actually left because the situation was so tense. Yeah. Did you also do stories about Serbs leaving?
Most of the Serbs had left. What I did do, I went around and I saw villages that were on fire, that were being systematically, house by house, burnt down. And I interviewed Serbs, where they'd sent their women and children out, and they were there basically to protect their properties. And this was near Istok. I first went to the Spanish KFOR camp, interviewed an official there, and then I went to some of these villages. And the fire engines would come out, and they'd put out the fire, and they were slow, smoldering fires, but it was a systematic operation by remnants of the UÇK orals to simply get rid of them. And so I covered that aspect there in particular. And this was still going on when I moved to Kosovo in 2003. I remember sitting in a cafe in in Prizren and seeing that the Nun Kalaya, Podkalaya was, yet another house was in flames, and people would just sort of look up at 2 or 3 houses maybe. People would just sort of look up at it and then go back to having their drink. It was also disturbing. Yeah, and I interviewed Father Sava on one or 2 occasions, and others. So yeah, it wasn't totally Albano-centric what I was reporting.
So you said you came in 2003. There's a big
shift
yeah. In your. You're interested in international affairs. You're interested in Eastern Europe. You work as a journalist. Seems to be a nice fit to be a journalist in this for what you were doing. And then in 2003, there is a change in your
right.
life.
Yeah.
How did you decide to? And how were you hired by America?
Okay.
How did you decide to change?
I had been interested in working in the UN ever since I was in grade school. When we were in the 3rd grade, we were taken to the UN to see the flags outside, shown around. For me, it was something rather natural, except that when I then started looking at it after graduate school, I didn't have any experience. All I had was an education, and the languages that I had weren't really the languages that they needed. And so it was put on hold. In the 1990s, the UN did less than a stellar job in Bosnia and Croatia, and I saw as a reporter how much they were despised and how weak they were in carrying out their mandate, or maybe one could say how weak their mandate was. And here, initially, no, I didn't have any sort of strong feeling that, yeah, this is something I should do, work for UNMIK. I was rather shocked by the number of UN vehicles in the streets, particularly at rush hour, that basically the UN was financing people's commuting within Prishtinë.
So let me stop just for a second.
In 99.
So you had quite an idealistic view of the UN. You wanted to, the reality...
I was not naive. I had studied it as a graduate student at SAIS International Relations, and had discussed the UN with professors in various seminars, and I had concluded already in 1978 or so that the solution of the UN was to burn down the Secretariat and start from scratch. I actually said that in a class. So this wasn't something new to me. I was fairly well read on the topic as an outsider.
But what was the positive attraction? Okay, we understand that you understood the reality and the shortcomings of the UN, but what was the positive?
The positive attraction was as follows. In Kosovo, this was the first time the United Nations was actually administering a territory. On a temporary basis, it was the United Nations interim administration in Kosovo. The name has never been officially changed. And the idea was, the understanding was, if you read 1244 very carefully, that this was a holding operation until such time as the international community could agree on a way forward, that it would be unseemly to give Kosovo independence on a silver platter in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. This was not a war of independence, despite what some may describe it subsequently as. It was a miscalculation. One could argue it was a miscalculation by Clinton and by others, Blair notably. What were they really thinking, and where was this going to go? Were they compensating for not having been tough enough on Milosevic at Dayton and forced Kosovo onto the negotiating table at Dayton in 95? Well, had they done that successfully, who knows, we might be sitting in Serbia now rather than in Kosovo. Yeah, so I knew something about Kosovo. I was fascinated by it. The fact was the UN was running the place. Now, I didn't know the first thing about civil administration. But while I was here on a reporting visit in 2002, at a time when the SRSG was Michael Steiner, whom I had known previously, and whom I had intended to interview. And I was looking for a contact number, and then on the website, and I noticed they had a jobs page, and there was an opening for a political analyst in Pjesa. I said, this is tailor-made for me. I can move to Pjesa. I've already taken 2 courses in Albanian. I can more or less make myself understood in Serbian. I'd done Albanian summer school in Tirana and then in Prishtinë the previous 2 years. So this looks tailor-made, why don't I do it? So I got an interview with Steiner, and I told him about it. He said, show me the job opening. I showed it to him. He said, why would you want to be in Pjesa? I said, well, Prishtinë is an English language bubble now. I mean, why would I want to be here? I'm curious about the culture, I want to see how this place develops, but if I'm going to be in an English-speaking environment, I'm going to be rather isolated from reality. He said, well, you're no good to me in Pjesa. If you want to work as my advisor in the Office of Political Affairs, not my advisor, but if you want to work with me in the Office of Political Affairs, then it's going to be Prishtinë, so make up your mind. So I said, okay, I'll take Prishtinë. So it was a compromise. Had I insisted on going to Pjesa, I might have gotten the job, but I would have been out of a job after a year, and I would have probably gone back to Radio Free Europe or whatever. What I found fascinating and why I stayed was not only because I like Kosovo, I like hiking in the mountains, I like the location, I like everything except what Obilic produces in the way of bad air. I was finally on the inside looking out in terms of decision making. I was no longer the speculating journalist being kept outside on the other side of the closed doors, wondering what the decisions were being made and why we weren't being told the whole story. Now I was on the inside where decisions were being made, and I was seeing for the first time in my life how they were being made. And I was participating in that process. And that was something that attracted me, hooked me, and there was no walking away from it after a year or two. Because I was valued for my knowledge of the area, of the society, for the lack of any startup time. I came here, I could immediately start reporting, working, writing from day one. I had contacts, and I could build on those contacts immediately. Politically, like Bosnia, and to a lesser extent Serbia and Croatia, it was dynamic. There were changes. If you were away for 2 weeks, you almost had to start from scratch to catch up. And there was an assumption, in retrospect a naive assumption, by among the Americans, Germans, and French and Italians, that, by 2006, 2007 at the latest, Kosovo would be independent and UNMIK would be shut down. And then, who knows, there'd be some other mission to go to. And when already in 2005, I got my first request to go to another mission, to Sudan, while I was on holiday in Norway, my boss said, just tell them we need you here and say thanks but no thanks. They came back from Sudan at least once, Darfur, and I was always told, just, we need you here. And then subsequently I thought I was going to Afghanistan, and this went all the way up to the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping. No, stay where you are. When the time comes, we'll look after you. And then in the end I retired after 14 years. There are many other missions I would have been interested in working in, and I applied repeatedly. However, the system within the United Nations, Department of Peacekeeping Affairs and Department of Field Service personnel is dysfunctional when it comes to mobility. They're introducing a new system now. It's, I question whether it's going to be any more functional than anything that existed in the past, but essentially you don't get any job unless you know someone. I never got a job anywhere without knowing someone, and that includes at UNMIC. And it's unfortunately the way things work in the UN, and not only in the UN.